I'd like to introduce our next presenter, who is Richard Ostler. Richard, and I've got to get this right, Richard is Head of Agri-ecoinformatics and at Rothamsted Research. And his talk is entitled Adopting FAIR, that's capital F, capital A, capital I, capital R, FAIR Principles for Rothamsted's Long-Term Agricultural Experiments. Richard.
Thank you. So I shall just share my screen and make a start. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the presentation now. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be presenting today. I started my career working on the NBN gateway, and that really started my career in data. So I've now moved on to Rothamsted, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing to adopt FAIR data principles for our long-term experiments. So our long-term experiments started in the mid-19th century with Laws and Gilbert, and these include broadbalk wheat and park grass, two of our most famous experiments, which are still running to this day. And since then, we've had other new experiments come on. The most recent being the large-scale rotation experiments at Broom's Barn, which are testing various different treatment and cropping system factors. And this is a feature of our experiments, is that they test many different things, whether it's crop fertilization, the cropping system, crop protection, or management. And they've been running on and off for over 170 years. And so we have a huge amount of data and a great diversity of data, from yield traits, disease assessments, botanical and invertebrate surveys, soil properties management, and increasingly more novel types of data, particularly phenotyping data, drone data, and various other sorts. And today, the experiments are funded as a BBSRC national capability, and there's a requirement of that funding to make the data as accessible as possible. And to try and address that, in 2013, we published our website ERA, but this, of course, was before the publication of the FAIR principles. So just to recap on what FAIR means. So FAIR was published, the guidelines were published in 2016, and it stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable. So what that really means is, can people find your data? And if people can find your data, do they know how it can be accessed? And if people can access your data, can they integrate that data with other related data sets? And is your data sufficiently well described to allow people to reuse it in a sensible way? So on our ERA website, we do some of that. So we have lots of background information for our long-term experiments. We have dataset tables available, and they're described. But are we really fair? Well, if we go back and look at the FAIR data principles, there's 15 core guidelines. You can go away and look these up, but very briefly, it's doing things like assigning a unique persistent identifier to your data, so something like a DOI. It's making sure your data are described with a rich set of metadata, and crucially, this metadata is machine readable and can be indexed, and if it can be indexed, it's searchable, so people can find your data. And it's making sure that you use community standards, whether it's controlled vocabularies, ontologies, or metadata schemas to describe your data. And that your data is published with a rich plurality of information. So things like, what are the access rights and the licensing associated with that? What's the provenance? So if we go back and look at what we're doing on ERA, then actually, no, we're not fair. So we don't routinely publish with DOIs. We have a lot of content, but it's unstructured. It's more in the form of narrative. So while it's readable for a human, it's not readable for a machine. So that means we can't index the data in search engines and so on. And we don't make good use of existing community standards as well. So a lot of our work over the last couple of years has really been trying to address this shortcoming and make our data fair. And so we've really done three things to try and address this. So the first is improving and redesigning the website. I should say the new version of the website that I'm showing you some slides of is not yet live. We've been delayed a bit by COVID, but it should be up and running by the end of the year. So the first thing we're doing is providing a much better description for each of our experiments, and we're doing this in a consistent way. We're using two metadata schemas to do this. So the first is schema.org, So this provides us with a lot of the core metadata, so the administrative metadata that we use to describe the experiment. So who runs it, how's it funded, where's it located. But sitting on top of that, we use something called the Global Long-Term Experiments Network schema. A bit of a mouthful, but it allows us to express, again, in a very structured way, the design of the experiment, so and any changes that have happened to that design over time. It allows us to express in a good, rich way the different treatment factors for that experiment. So if it's fertilization or management. And it also lets us describe or characterize the experiment in terms of its environment, such as soil and climate, and the types of data set that are available. Underneath that, we're publishing all of our data sets with DOI. So this allows us to give each of our data sets a persistent unique identifier. And with that DOI, the way DOIs are structured, there is a good metadata schema that we can plug into for that. So we can provide information about the methods of data collection, the access conditions and the licensing conditions. And this is all machine readable. So our metadata now is harvestable, and so it can appear in our own institute repository, but it can also be harvested and indexed by things like Google Dataset Search. This really broadens out the access to the data, or the discoverability of these data sets. And one of the other benefits of this is we can use DOIs to build what we call a knowledge graph to describe the relationships between these different resources. So on this diagram, you can see in gold, we have a yield data set for wheat from the modern period. So broad bulk is split into 3 key periods. And there's a relationship between this data set to other data sets. And we can express this using the metadata. And this is really powerful because it shows you how you can sensibly use data sets with other data sets, and when it isn't sensible to use a data set with another data set. So it puts the data that we provide in context with other data sets and other resources. So it really helps people understand how to use that data. Finally, we're refactoring the experiment data itself, the data tables itself. So previously we would have published using very complex, heavily formatted Excel spreadsheets, which actually are not that usable. And so we've really simplified this to provide very flat and simple tabular CSV formats. But this is a much more accessible way of providing the data. And running alongside that, we have a much more rigorous metadata to describe these tables. So this is like your data dictionary, but we've gone a little bit further with this. And one of the ways we've added and enhanced this is to start adding semantic annotations to the data. So on this slide, hopefully you can see these things here which look like URLs. So these are what we call semantic annotations. So they link to a controlled vocabulary. And that means where we annotate with these sorts of what we call URIs, concept URIs. If another data set is using the same URI, then we can link those data sets together automatically. So this is what we really mean by interoperability of the data. So we've done quite a lot, but does it mean we measure up to the FAIR principles? And I think we do. So we're doing a lot more now. We're providing the persistent identifiers. We're giving everything a DOI. So that means that we have good, rich metadata, metadata that's in context, but crucially metadata that's registered in a searchable resource, so people can more easily find the data sets that we're publishing. We're publishing the data in context, and we're making sure that the data is as interoperable as possible. So we're making it easier for people to use that data, not just as a standalone resource, but alongside other related resources. And we're also making it very clear what the conditions for accessing and using this data, reusing this data are. And it's been quite a learning curve. So we've been working on this over a couple of years, and I think there's 3 key lessons that we've learned. The first, I don't think this is true for everyone who's ever tried to do something like this, is you can't change your culture overnight. Adopting FAIR has been a big culture change, not just for our data curators and data managers, but also for the people producing the data and the people using the data. And you have to be sensitive to their needs. But ultimately, the changes that we're we're introducing are there to make life easier. But you just have to carry people with you, because it, as I say, it's a new way of thinking. Budgets are not limited. So at the start of this, we have very big ambitions, but not necessarily the financial or human resources to really fulfill those ambitions. So there has to be a trade-off. That's it. It's a frustration, but you have to work within the resources that you've got. I think another third one, although it's last, is a very important one, and that's the skills gap. So certainly in agriculture, there is a big skills gap globally with managing long-term experiment data. People run experiments, they collect the data, but then they don't really know what to do with it. So there has to be investment in training people, data managers who understand the data to use this. And so it's a case of developing best practices and making sure that and encouraging people to adopt them, because long-term experiments are a very unique resource for data, and they can really help us understand the processes, particularly in soil, which can take many decades, and with things like climate change at the moment, and understanding how soil in particular can help with things like carbon capture. These sorts of experiments are becoming increasingly valuable, and making the data accessible from them it is becoming increasingly important. And one of the ways that we're looking at developing these best practices for managing this sort of data is using things like data carpentry, so that we can really upskill practitioners in this area. So my final slide, why go FAIR in the first place? So for us, putting FAIR into practice means that people can more easily discover and reuse the data. And this is one of the reasons why we're funded to do this, is to make the data accessible. But using DOIs means that our data can be recognised and it can be attributed. And having it as a machine readable format hopefully means that the data can be used in new ways. So adopting FAIR really democratises access to a unique collection of data. It means that the producers and curators of that data can be recognised, and it supports things like reproducible science and can enable new data science approaches on that data. But perhaps most importantly for us is it increases the impact of the experiments and their data, and it means that this data can be more easily measured, and it also demonstrates that crucial return on investment to funders, so they can see how the data is having an impact. So thank you very much, and just a quick thank you to the team involved in the long-term experiments.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. That's fascinating. I do have a question. Anybody, have we got any questions come in, Mandy?
We have got one question, which is from
sorry,
Mike.
Oh, no, you're very little on the screen. Sorry, Joe, I apologize.
That's okay. We do have one question, which is from Michael Dodd, who says, some of the long-term data is very complex with many changes over time, and some of the results are very complex too. For example, the visual surveys of park grass. How can all the details be captured even when some of the raw data is difficult to read by humans?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's one that we've really struggled with over the last couple of years. So the approach we've taken is to try and split the data up into sort of more meaningful chunks. So there's within the long-term experiments, there's definite boundaries within data sets, where there's, and these are usually as a result of changes to either the management of the experiment, or in the case of something like broadbalk, it will be changes to the cultivars that are used. So that the change from long straw or heritage varieties to short stem varieties was a huge change, and it doesn't make sense to use the data in most cases before and after that change together. So it's really about documenting and capturing in the metadata the changes that are happening to really allow people to do that. And we're looking at various different ways of visualizing the data to sort of tell that narrative. So we're using things like, or looking at using things like timelines to guide people through the data. But yeah, there's a lot of other things we can do as well. So it's putting the data in context. So it's making sure that when you publish the data, you're not just publishing a simple observation, you're publishing everything around that plot where the thing was observed, for example. So making sure you've got the treatment history there as well to go alongside it. So hopefully that answers your question, but if not, I can follow up later.
Are there any others, Joe?
Yeah, we have one other question from Kieran Brown. Do you publish your fair data policy publicly online?
Not yet, but we will be. Yes.
Good. Okay.
Yeah, as I say, unfortunately everything has been a bit delayed by COVID. We had problems accessing servers and stuff with people working from home, so we're a bit behind. But once we go live, all of this stuff will become available.